after receiving troubling visions of his wife's death and the even more troubling confession that his friend, the Chancellor, is not only an evil Sith Lord, but the only avenue to save Padme's life, Anakin is pondering a difficult decision. Does he let the Chancellor be brought to justice, condemning his wife to certain death, or does he betray his friends, the Jedi Knights, and tries to save his wife, while probably also earning the position of number 2 in the new galactic order? You probably know this situation from Star Wars Episode 3, and even if you've never been in this exact situation before, you probably also know the feeling of having to make a hard decision where different considerations pull you in different directions. In Anakin's case, the desire to protect his wife and his lust for power compel him to betray the Jedi, while his loyalty to his friends and the oaths and laws that bind him are telling him to let the Chancellor be captured. In this situation, the basic question that Anakin is probably asking himself is, what should I do? And with different duties pulling in different directions, the answer is not obvious. The branch of philosophy that asks the question, what should I do, is called moral philosophy. And attempts to answer this question typically take the form of some law that has to be followed in order to always yield the correct results. Examples of such laws that you might have heard of is Kant's categorical imperative, always act in such a way that you wish everybody would act, or Bentham's utilitarianism, always take the option that maximizes well-being and minimizes suffering. Without going too much into details of the pros and cons of the different theories and what they would prescribe in this specific situation, they do not seem to capture what is actually happening. It would be completely out of character for him to think about his galaxy-conquering attitude to become a natural law, or to estimate the expected utility of a galactic empire. What is essential to this situation is the judgment that Anakin has to execute to decide between which duties to act upon, and no calculation or rule following can replace that judgment. This is the core insight of the moral pluralism theory of the philosopher William Ross. According to this theory, there is no one rule that we can blindly follow and thereby make good decisions. Our life choices are determined by a multitude of duties, such as justice, beneficence, and loyalty, and those duties are not well ordered. We cannot say in general that it is always better to be loyal than to be just, or the other way around. Whenever these duties, or prima facie duties, how he calls them, come into conflict, we have to execute judgment to decide which one is more pressing. Ross also made an attempt to find out what these duties are. But even if we knew that, there would still be an unanswered question. Where do these duties come from? How do we derive them? And how do we know that we have the correct ones? Let's say Anakin thinks his prima facie duties are loyalty to his friends, keeping laws and promises, protecting his family, and becoming as powerful as possible. You might think you have reason to point at one of them and say, that one seems a little off. But with no way of explaining where these prima facie duties come from, it might be hard to talk about one of them being wrong, or knowing what that is even supposed to mean. Another philosopher, Brad Hooker, leveled such a criticism against Ross's theory. He claims that moral theories should explain what, if anything, ties together our various principles and justifies them, and that Ross's pluralism is a bit thin on that front. He attempted to build a theory how to derive prima facie duties. The theory he found most compelling was a variant of rule-consequentialism. He claims that the correct prima facie duties are those that would lead to the most well-being and fairness if they were inculcated in the overwhelming majority of the next generation. This sounds complicated, but stay with me. Let's unpack this piece by piece. First, we have well-being and fairness. Those things are to be maximized, so Hooker says they're good and we want more of them. So far so clear. He doesn't really go into detail on what these things are actually supposed to be, but I think we have a rough idea of them, so let's leave that aside for now. Even though he says these things are good, he doesn't want us to maximize them directly. Remember, the whole theory is not about what we should do directly, but which prima facie duties are the correct ones. We then orient our actions according to the prima facie duties. At this point you might be a bit confused. What's the difference between striving for fairness and well-being directly and choosing prima facie duties that maximize them, and then act according to those? Let's take the example of promises. So you have a kid, and I want to take your kid away and raise it and teach it the way of the Force. So I promise you that I'll take good care of it. but then this kid turns out to be a bit of a psychopath, and it would be slightly more convenient for me to ditch it and raise another kid. That one would be easier to manage and probably also do more good. Now, will it maximize well-being and fairness to ditch the kid? Let's stipulate it does. So if I would maximize well-being and fairness directly, I should by all means ignore my promise. But would the general rule, ignore promises if convenient, maximize fairness and well-being if everybody followed it? Probably not, because then poor mothers from Tatooine would not give their little kids to Jedi Knights, because their promises to raise them would be worth very little. So this is what the whole extra step with the duties is for. Let's go back to the proposed rule. The correct prima facie duties are those that would lead to the most well-being and fairness if they were inculcated in the overwhelming majority of the next generation. Now, what does this part with the next generation mean? That we don't have to do anything and let the next generation figure everything out? I mean, we do take that attitude towards some problems. Sorry, back to Star Wars metaphors. No, that's not what it's supposed to mean. To see how that part is necessary, let's see what goes wrong if we leave it out. If we simplify the theory to the correct prima facie duties are those that would lead to the most well-being and fairness if everybody just had them. To see what's going wrong then, imagine the following scenario. Your kid has some severe injury and will only survive if they get a life-saving, expensive treatment. This is no problem for you, you have a lot of money. But if you donated that money, you could save the life of 2 other kids in a low-income country. I mean planet. We're not talking about the real world, of course. Would it lead to more well-being to save your own kid? Would it be fair not to save the others just because of where they were born? The duty that maximizes well-being and fairness would be save as many people as possible, no matter whether you know them or not. But this kind of duty is just alien to human nature, and having a moral theory that demands it will get you nowhere. So we need some way of excluding duties that are too demanding. On the other hand, you don't want it to be too lax. If you exclude any duty that might be hard to follow at first, this might be an easy excuse to dismiss any moral obligation that would be too much of a hassle. Yeah, it would be fair if women would vote, but that just goes against human nature, man, too demanding. The part with inculcated future generations is Hooker's way to draw that line. Imagine the next generation would grow up with the belief that they have some duty. Would they adopt it and thereby create well-being and happiness? A generation growing up with the duty to let women participate in politics, that worked out. But a generation growing up that they have the duty to sacrifice their kids anytime they could save more lives, that doesn't seem like something people would accept. So this is what Hooker's theory says. Duties must maximize well-being and fairness, still do so if they are a rule followed by everyone, and not be so demanding that you couldn't live up to them if you grew up with them. Now that we've understood the theory for how to select prima facie duties, let's return to Anakin's dilemma. Family and lust for power on the one hand, loyalty and oaths on the other. And now we have the vocabulary to challenge one of those duties. Would there really be more well-being and fairness if the next generation grew up inculcated with the lust for power? Damn, that question hits close to home. Anyway, back to topic. Presumably not. So we can cross that one off the list of conflicting duties. And now you're only one call of judgment away from destroying the galaxy. What do you think? Is there more to ethics than following rules? How do you decide when your duties come into conflict? And is there some way to derive these duties from first principles?